It is 30 years since hundreds, perhaps thousands of pro-democracy protesters were killed in the heart of China's capital. How did the Tiananmen Square massacre help to shape a modern superpower? And can the hopes of those protesters ever be revived? Welcome to Roundtable. Well, on the spot where it happened, acts of mourning and remembrance are forbidden. But outside China, the world is remembering what happened in Tiananmen Square 30 years ago, an event with consequences that are still felt today.
Tiananmen Square, Beijing, where Mao Zedong declared the founding of the People's Republic of China in 1949. 40 years later, it would be the scene of the most notorious crackdown on pro-democracy protesters in the 20th century. Over the past 3 decades, China's economic boom has lifted millions out of poverty and kept the country on course to become the world's largest economy. But the reach of its security state has deepened, restricting what people do online and at home, aimed at choking any chance of another protest movement. And since President Xi Jinping came into power in 2012, critics say the country has become more autocratic, cracking down on his rivals, investing billions on a bigger military, and leading a more aggressive foreign policy. In August 2018, a UN committee heard that up to 1 million Uyghur Muslims were being detained in the western Xinjiang region, something the Chinese authorities denied. Commemorating Tiananmen is forbidden in mainland China, but the international community and survivors continue to remind the world of the struggle for democracy and human rights.
Well, joining us at the round table today is Stephen Chan from the School of Oriental and African Studies. We also have in the studio with us Andreas Fulda, the Senior Fellow at the University of Nottingham Asia Research Institute. And joining us from Washington, D.C., on the left there, we have Bennett, Executive Director of the Center on Contemporary China at Princeton University, and Sophie Richardson, the China Director at Human Rights Watch. Sophie, I'd like to start with you, if I may. Interestingly, you went to China as a student yourself back in 1989, 30 years ago, and you've been visiting ever since, and we're going to get on to your work at HRW in a moment. But first, if I can just ask, what were your impressions going there just months after the killings?
Well, it was hard to know what to expect, but the memory I take away with me is seeing students my own age who were forced to go to additional political education classes after they'd finished their normal courses for the day. And we were meant to have had roommates move in with us from that university as soon as we arrived. And the image of watching them endure that kind of indoctrination day after day after day, and when we had come from an environment in which we had, plenty of rights afforded to us, I think left a lifelong impression about the need to work for everybody to have rights.
And what do you think were the key demands of those protesters then? And to what extent have those demands been utterly unfulfilled?
Well, certainly the demands for democracy or more political participation have gone unmet. Some of the calls were also for greater economic opportunity, and perhaps in a more rational moment, some people in the government would say that they've delivered on that. But the sense of the protesters' demands for openness, for transparency, for participation, none of that has really been answered.
Yeah, Stephen Chan, do you think that lives were lost in those fateful days in '89 for nothing?
Sometimes it seems so. Sometimes I'm very depressed and think that that is exactly the case. People were very idealistic. They wanted to achieve a breakthrough. I think the breakthrough would have been good for China. Right now, we're not seeing the results of the sacrifice that those young people made.
And Andreas, you've said in discussion before the show that you sense that this time, in 2019, there's some sense that there could be a change.
Certainly, there's a sense of déjà vu in a sense that like in the 1980s, there was a rapid period of transition that didn't benefit everyone, which is kind of similar to what we are seeing right now, although a lot of people are excited about China's economic growth. But actually, inequality has widened. And in that sense, Xi Jinping and the Chinese Communist Party hasn't really delivered on the promise. And furthermore, now with the trade war with the United States, actually, it's quite likely that the Chinese economy will take a hit, which will directly affect the Chinese Communist Party. And so we shouldn't be too surprised if in the coming months and perhaps years, there will be some turbulence ahead.
Jan Bennett, before we come to the possibility of turbulence ahead, just explain what you do at Princeton University. What do you teach your class about what happened in Tiananmen?
So I work at the Center on Contemporary China at Princeton University. We're a research institution that studies China from a social science perspective. So it's mostly sociology. What we teach about Tiananmen is exactly what happened, that the students were protesting for political rights that were never achieved.
Do you also think that those lives, most of them young, were lost in vain?
Personally, yes. I do believe that. Working with students, especially Chinese students, foreign nationals who are studying at Princeton and at other universities in the United States, they know about Tiananmen. Those students domestically, that's a piece of their lost history.
And what is it about contemporary China that makes you think that it was in vain?
Well, the fact that the domestic populace of China, they don't speak about this. And if you look at the sources of social unrest in China, it's not advocating for political rights. It's more advocating for quality of life issues, environmental degradation to their neighborhoods, for example, land seizures that are uncompensated. So you can see that there is a distinct lack of political protest in China because of what happened in Tiananmen.
Yeah, but Sophie, I mean, it's not that necessarily they don't want to talk about it, but they're actually not allowed to talk about it. In what ways is the Chinese government making it an issue, a non-issue, if you like, and sort of scrubbing it from history?
Well, not only does the government essentially control what goes into textbooks or all of the state media, it's also not at all shy about prosecuting people who are challenging it publicly. And one of the cases early on in Xi Jinping's tenure involved the prosecution of some activists who were campaigning for public asset disclosure, essentially anti-corruption measures, which the party itself says it's very enthusiastic about. And so a handful of people went out on the street with signs that said almost exactly what senior officials themselves had said, except those individuals were prosecuted on public disorder charges, for taking an independent initiative. So, I think when a broader population is aware that even people who are advocating on issues that the government itself says it's enthusiastic about, that they're vulnerable to prosecution, they're going to be awfully careful about what they choose to say or do in public.
I mean, Stephen, every anniversary, the Chinese government makes efforts to reduce and mitigate the marking of the massacre itself. And this year has been no different. People have been taken away for enforced holidays, and people's social media accounts are being watched and so on. Is that right?
All of that is true. They haven't been able to stop, however, marking the anniversary in surrounding areas.
Right.
My friends in Hong Kong, they themselves had their own yellow umbrella movement suppressed by the Chinese people. So they're feeling very sensitively about this. I think the entire Chinese diaspora is not going to let this one die away, even though people in China itself may be cowed by state repression on this issue.
Although, interesting, isn't it, Sophie? You were mentioning how China can even reach the diaspora in Canada. Tell us about the example you mentioned with WeChat.
We wrote a piece last year about the use of WeChat, which is a very popular app that people use to communicate with each other in Chinese, but it's owned by a large Chinese company. And last year, we noted that a Canadian MP, who is herself of ethnic Chinese descent, was using WeChat to communicate with Chinese-speaking constituents in Canada. And she had posted a piece on both her Facebook page and on WeChat, offering up some support to the pro-democracy movement in Hong Kong. And we noticed that the post on the WeChat account had actually gotten taken down, which she wasn't aware of until we called her office. I think that's a powerful example of how a democratically elected representative, communicating freely with her constituents in a democracy like Canada can have her speech or that communication censored by somebody who's sitting inside China.
Andreas, I just want to ask you about Donald Trump's visit all of a sudden to the UK. I mean, he's here to try to persuade Britain not to allow Huawei, for example, to set up the 5G infrastructure because he's concerned about the possibility of state secrets going back to China. And we've seen that they are willing to stretch out the long arm into Canada, for example.
Well, it's certainly a national security issue, and given that 5G will be so instrumental for the development of smart cities, self-driving cars, hospital management, etc., I think we should be very careful about inviting either Chinese companies or perhaps even US state companies to build European infrastructure. In my mind, it should be clear that we should build our own capacity to keep control over this very important infrastructure.
Jan, talking about how the Chinese use technology now to keep the population in line, if you like. Can you just explain how they use it to monitor people?
The facial recognition software that can track people from just their facial features. They've also started at gait recognition software that recognizes you by the way you walk, for example. There's the social credit system that gives you demerits for jaywalking, for example, which also combines with the facial recognition software. So what happens is that you get enough demerits. You can't buy airplane tickets, for example, train tickets. You can't borrow money.
And so how might you earn credits on such a social credit system then?
I think Sophie might be able to speak more to what is given credit.
You want to come in there, Sophie?
Sure. One of the best examples recently of how to earn credit is a new app that was designed presumably by the party itself, on which you can sort of take quizzes to demonstrate the depth of your knowledge of Xi Jinping thought. And if you do well on this particular quiz, you can actually earn a credit score.
Right. Andreas, this technology is so prevalent in China, and we have, as they mentioned, the social credit system. Surely that's going to prevent what you were alluding to earlier, which is the sort of bubbling discontent from becoming anything more serious, and it's certainly to prevent another Tiananmen Square.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that kind of analysis overlooks that within the party, Xi Jinping is not terribly popular because he's been far too draconian in his approach. He demands a lot of loyalty, not just to the Chinese Communist Party, but to himself. And so just imagine if you had to do this quiz every day, that's not going to endear him to you. And see, I've spoken to government officials for many years, and it's quite noticeable that they're very upset and in a way even angry about this development. They feel that they cannot speak their mind, that they're being overly controlled. And I think the moment we see more mishaps by Xi Jinping, I mentioned the trade war, for example, but there are other examples as well. We should not underestimate how unpopular he really is within the party and the establishment.
Stephen, can you talk to that? Is Xi Jinping, I mean, we've read numerous surveys and reports that he's actually considered by some the most powerful man in the world. He had his own thoughts actually incorporated formally into the Communist Party thinking, and he seems to have consolidated power. But Andreas is saying that actually there are some vulnerabilities there.
It's not a total consolidation.
Yeah.
It's certainly a very strong effort at consolidation, but you make enemies as you do this, and enemies have got long memories. In fact, the whole image of the monolithic Chinese Communist Party is in fact a bit of a legend. Many of the students actually escaped the massacre at Tiananmen. Senior party people who felt sorry for them helped smuggle them out of the country. That's how some of them wound up at my university, for instance, with tales exactly of that kind of help. Those fracture lines have been camouflaged and masked over in China, but they haven't gone away. And with these very selective corruption trials, senior, powerful people in the party, their friends will remember that they could be next and build up reserves to oppose this in the future.
And what does that mean for the possibility of reform?
If there is change, it doesn't necessarily mean reform.
Right.
It may mean a slightly more humane version of repression with a human face, if you like. All this technology that's been deployed now isn't going to be taken off the shelf just because there's a change of leadership at the top. We're entering a whole new global era of this kind of surveillance. The Russians are doing it. The Americans, for all of their pious words, certainly have got the capacity to do this. These cyber wars will have a global impact. Right now, I think we're just trying to pick off one of the leading candidates for propagating this kind of cyber warfare.
You don't think that the Chinese are an exception, the way they use it is exceptionally intrusive and harsh?
Certainly in Chinese society, it's particularly intrusive. But as I said, everyone has got this kind of technology able to use it should they wish at some stage in the future. It is a new era that we're entering into.
Leaving aside the technology that's used now to monitor people, in terms of sheer ability to stage a crackdown of this nature that we saw 30 years ago, does the Communist Party still have that in them?
No, I think the one thing that has been learned, the one take-home from the worldwide response of horror to what happened at Tiananmen is a desire to be disciplinarian, but not with such a heavy hand. The way that they approached the yellow umbrellas in Hong Kong is a case in point. They wanted to suppress it, but they weren't going to kill the students or their professors. They made sure that over a period of time, they all got hauled up before the courts and given punishments of one sort or another. There is a moderation in terms of how they treat dissent, but they still will not tolerate dissent.
Sophie, do you think monitoring it, the situation there as closely as you do with Human Rights Watch, that the Chinese government could no longer go as far as it did in 1989? Or is there still evidence that it can be that harsh if it needs to be?
Yeah, I mean, I largely agree with what Professor Zhang just said. I think the Communist Party took away from 1989 the lesson that it was costly to the regime to kill unarmed protesters, and especially to do so in front of the world's media. At the same time, I certainly wouldn't suggest that the capacity for brutality has mitigated, and there's no better example of that now than the arbitrary detention of approximately 1 million Uyghurs in Xinjiang, who are literally being detained outside of any kind of legal proceeding, and simply because they are Uyghur. So I think, when we talk about the Chinese government's capacity for violence, we may not necessarily be talking about, tanks on the street, but rather the violence of people being incredibly insecure in their daily lives and vulnerable to state abuse.
Professor Zhang, is that the case, that actually what it learned, the government in China, is not to air its dirty laundry in public, but if you are going to persecute people, do it secretly and in a hidden location, black jails or perhaps in the remote areas of Western China?
Well, I mean, the entire province where most of the Uyghur people live is not exactly hidden, and is very, very observable by precisely all kinds of smart media these days. The Chinese are simply bad at religion, and to a certain extent, in the case of the Uyghurs, there's also a hint of racism. Han Chinese, they're not going to kill the children of Han Chinese anymore. There's a very Confucian element there that they finally learned to take on board. You don't kill your own children. The Uyghurs aren't necessarily their children, even though they're meant to be part of China. There's this kind of series of binaries building up, contradictions in the Chinese body politic, which does not speak well for the future.
Sophie, I mean, I don't know if you agree with that. I mean, I think it's quite difficult to monitor what's happening with the Uyghurs.
Yeah, I mean, we're not exactly talking about a region in which there is open or easy access. I mean, think about all of the Uyghurs around the world who have no ability to contact their family members. But also on the point about who the regime is more or less sensitive to, let's please recall the July 2017 death in detention of the 2010 Nobel Peace Prize winner Liu Xiaobo, who is about as Han as you can get. And I think the disdain with which his health and other fairly high-profile political prisoners has been treated by authorities, I think suggests that it's more to do, or it can be at least as much about your political views as about your ethnicity in the kind of really horrific treatment you can be given by the Chinese Communist Party.
Would you agree with that, Andreas?
Yeah, and it's not just dissidents who've been, let's say, at the receiving end. Actually, the reason why I think within the party there are a lot of people who are really unhappy is the party has been also extremely cruel to its own people, regardless of whether they've been corrupt or perhaps too liberal or flouting some other party rules. And in that sense, the cruelty has never really gone away. The Chinese Communist Party has always used carrots and sticks at the same time. So the idea that they've become more liberal over the years is probably not true.
I sort of talk and sort of come towards the end of our discussion with how the West and other countries treat China. Jan, you were a US diplomat in China for a while, and you must be observing the visit by President Donald Trump to the United Kingdom with some curiosity. When you have the official opposition leader in this country, Jeremy Corbyn, unwilling to meet President Donald Trump, but willing a few years ago to meet President Xi Jinping at a state dinner anyway. Do you think that the Chinese are given an easier ride of it sometimes with about their human rights record than, say, the United States? And is that not hypocrisy?
Yes, I agree with you on that.
Why do you think the West
Trump
is willing to overlook such things when dealing with China?
It's because China has an enormously fast-growing economy, and we all want to benefit from it.
The trade war that's currently on is purely focused on economics. President Trump doesn't appear to be using it as leverage to improve human rights in China. Is that right?
Not at all. You're correct on that.
Let me ask you, Stephen Chan, we're here in London. Jeremy Corbyn, for example, unwilling to meet with Trump because of human rights, but willing to meet with President Xi Jinping. What is it about China that people are willing to forgive? Is it that because they don't expect any better, or is it because of the economic power that's increasing?
I think two things. The economic power is certainly increasing. The Chinese have arrived economically. They influence all of our lives. Also, I think that there is a feeling in the left that at one point in time, China was the abused party precisely by the West. It may be their turn now, and they may be exercising their turn in an increasingly volatile and untoward manner. But there's still that memory of an imperial past towards what China still calls its century of humiliation, for very good reason. That kind of contradiction is going to bestride all kinds of considerations in both liberal politics and in left politics for quite some time yet to come.
It is very complicated because although they may be trying to atone for some wrong that the West has done, it's not helping the people who are disappearing into black jails or whatever it might be. They are now being persecuted at the hands of a richer, more powerful state.
We're not going to do anything for them. It's a terrible thing for me to say. I'm Chinese. I want to be proud of being Chinese. Sometimes I'm very much not proud of being Chinese. At this moment in time, this is one of those moments when I'm unable to feel proud. I remember Tiananmen. I followed it from my university. We got the blurry faxes that came out in the days before the internet. Even with the limited technology available to us, it was horrific seeing what was happening at that moment in time.
Andreas, final thought then. As China becomes richer, more powerful militarily and others, will that mean that it becomes more emboldened to do what it wants domestically, or will it actually become more part of the sort of family of nations on a global level and wish to behave in a more humane manner to its own population?
Well, it certainly cannot be in our interest to see the consolidation of the regime in the long run. But I'm actually rather optimistic that Chinese society will be able to outgrow authoritarianism. Perhaps it is our job as outside observers to pay more attention to what could be termed unofficial China. Sophie, for example, mentioned some of the anti-corruption campaigners, the pro-democracy campaigners. There are lots of young people now who are taking a stand, the young Marxists, for example, the young feminists. So let's not give up on mainland China's democratization yet. I personally, I'm rather optimistic in the, let's say, medium to long term.
Andreas Fulda, thank you very much. And also thank you, Jan Bennett and Sophie Richardson and Professor Stephen Chan. Thank you for joining us once again. I do appreciate it. And thank you for watching. Remember, you can see this episode of Roundtable or our previous episodes on our YouTube channel. For now, though, goodbye.